Good morning.
Good morning.
Come on, we're the Harvard Business School. We can do better than that. Good morning.
Good morning.
For those of you that couldn't see, I stumbled coming up. I just wanted you to know, all my ex-students who know I was an ex-professional basketball player, I still got it. I still got it. No, I am so pleased to be here this morning and have a really distinct opportunity to introduce a really, really unique individual. But, oh my God, is it a challenge to introduce someone that everybody already knows? You know, as an example, I think about my daughter, who, while she was a teenager, and we'd be having dinner, I'd start to talk about my accomplishments at the school that day or serving on a board or a consulting project. And after she had heard just about as much as any teenage daughter could handle, she would say, "Dad, you know, you're a legend in your own mind. You know, it's not like you're Bill Gates or somebody who's a legend in his own time." Needless to say, we knew right at that point that she was HBS MBA material. And I'm pleased to say she's a member of the class of '05 of the MBA program. So how do you introduce someone that those of you who would in fact have been reading the Wall Street Journal a few days ago might have seen an exhibit that had a bubble chart in it that had the GDP of countries represented. And it was trying to capture the lost value over the last several weeks. And it had bubbles that indicated the size of the lost value. And then out at the end, it had a bubble labeled Bill Gates. This is not a person you got to spend a lot of time introducing, I don't think. But, you know, here at HBS, we always search for unique, unknown facts and insights. And so my challenge today is to introduce to you a different Bill Gates than you know. This is a man who has made a huge difference in the lives of many underserved and forgotten people. And what I want to introduce to you today is a Bill Gates that has a view on creative capitalism that really addresses many of the issues that our earlier panel raised about the broad, independent world that we live in and a set of activities that businesses may need to engage in to ensure those who are the least among us have equal opportunities. Now, in a classic HBS way, we need to start this exploration with maybe a view of Bill Gates you haven't actually seen before. You know, I'm sure you know all the classic stuff. Born in 1955 to William H. Gates II and Mary Gates. Grew up in Seattle with two sisters. Founded Corbus. Serves on the board of Berkshire Hathaway. 1994, married Melinda, French Gates. Enrolled in Harvard, 1973. Received his degree, 2007. Takes some of us a little bit longer, but what can I say? You know? But look, what I need to do is show you a picture of Bill Gates about 3 years before I met him. I first met him in 1980. And I think it's only appropriate to do this the Harvard Business School way by showing you this starting point for my introducing you to a very different Bill Gates than you might know. So if you will join me, I'd like to ask William H. Gates to join me on the stage at this point, and we'll begin our discussion. Bill? Okay, Mr. Gates, thank you so much for being with us. First of all, you got rid of my picture. I'd love for you to explain to our guests assembled here today exactly what the context was for this mugshot that we saw.
Well,
can you pull that back up, by the way? Can you pull? Yeah, good.
Oh, good.
I want him to know what I'm talking about here.
Well, I'd been in Boston, and when Paul Allen left, he left me a car, and so I got used to the driving style here in Boston. You know, the light goes green, you take a free left, no fault insurance. It was great. I got out to New Mexico. They weren't so enthused about that. And late at night, I was driving. The guy didn't like my left turn. He didn't like my speed. And he arrested me, took me in, and I didn't have enough money to bail myself out. So I spent a night in this fairly small cell with a bunch of guys who were drunk. So I wasn't smiling quite as well when Paul finally gathered enough change to bail me out the next morning. But that's my Albuquerque mugshot, and those glasses were very hip at the time.
And I absolutely love the haircut as well, by the way. All right.
That has not changed.
One more background question before I get to the core issue. These last few weeks, as we heard from the earlier panel, were just unprecedented, or nearly unprecedented in history. And although I want to talk about where you're going, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you what your perspective is on what we've been living through, and if you would care to venture that far, kind of what you think we ought to be doing at this point in time.
Well, it's certainly a fascinating thing. I have a person who helps manage all the foundation money and the non-Microsoft money I have. So he's got about 70 billion. Well, it was 70 billion. Now it's closer to 60 as of the weekend. But, you know, and I've been talking with him regularly, and I talk to Warren all the time just to explain it to me. And I think there's several interesting elements that come into this. The first is leverage. You know, the danger of leverage is pretty incredible. And it works so well for long periods of time. And then you get these brief periods where you pay the price that you've been so incredibly leveraged. The idea that you can model out and take history and get a lot of probabilities about events not being correlated really leads you down a primrose path. And the 3 years up until a few months ago really conditions were so benign in terms of defaults and the economy and everything. The fact that a lot of people got pulled down that path to push for yield, and the fact that you would, when you'd ask people, what do you expect to earn in the stock market, they'd name some number like 10% that was completely unsustainable. And I think the average was 15%. People are kind of spoiled. Well, that encourages people to get leveraged and take risk. And so we're certainly paying the price. The people who are leveraged are paying it disproportionately. I also think there's a lot here about complexity. You know, if you take a balance sheet, well, take a simple balance sheet like a Microsoft balance sheet, you know, it's easy. You have technological risk. I'm not trying to say our business, that the Microsoft business isn't hard to value, but it's easy to value in terms of what the assets or the liabilities look like. What's hard to say is, are those software inventions going to be enough of a leader that in volume and price they're going to continue to thrive? But it's all really centered around that. When you get a balance sheet of an investment bank, there ought to be like a big footnote that says, you know, none of us are smart enough to understand this thing. You know, my favorite example of this is, you know, Freddie Mac, you have 200 guys at Ofeo whose whole job is just to look at that one company, and still, you know, they're saying, okay, it shouldn't have been accounted for that way, it was fraudulent. Well, that's 200 people looking at the thing. And even, actually, those balance sheets, they have a certain complexity in terms of the nature of the risk, what the interest rate curve looks like, what housing prices look like. But a lot of it is they just pushed for extra yield. With the implicit guarantee, with the low debt, they went out there and took a lot of things that weren't really part of their mission and used that to supercharge the return on the private side. So, a little bit, we've probably been on borrowed time in terms of leverage, the leverage of the government in terms of overseas debt, the trade deficit, the leverage of the U.S. consumer. Whenever you get leverage like that, it builds up a problem. I think it's Volcker who said, and when you have a situation like this where you're just building up these imbalances, that he doesn't see how you get a happy ending to something with these tough imbalances. What we have now is kind of two things that are separate but deeply related. We have this financial credit crisis that actually was triggered when the economy was still doing fairly well. Unemployment was not super high. Even mortgage defaults were below 2%. And then you have, so that financial credit sector, and then you have the economy. Well, we've run an interesting experiment, which is for 3 weeks straight to run pictures from the Depression on the front page of the newspaper. And it sends an interesting message to these people over here in the economy thinking, should I buy a new car? Should I remodel? Should I expand my business? These guys over here have messed things up in a way that is sending a very powerful signal. I mean, consumer sentiment has never been as low. And so no matter how quickly this gets fixed up, bailing out the banks, doing various things, and I think smart people are looking hard and are looking at a lot of the right things, you're still going to have an economic cycle with a fairly significant recession. Will it be 18 months? Will it be 3 years? What will unemployment peak at? 7, 8, 9, probably north of 9. And that's just, even if this thing gets fixed, the financial piece of it, fairly quickly. And it's a little tricky when you're telling the taxpayers, oh, by the way, we're spending $700 billion as a down payment. Wait till the rest of it comes along to fix this, which there were some rich people over here who don't look too good. And by the way, you're all going to suffer because we're going to go through this economic cycle. Some of the things that are being said are almost like the politicians saying, okay, if you vote for me, there won't be an economic cycle. Well, that's not going to happen. The government cannot and should not try and stand in front of that, stimulate our way out of that. And so I think it's one of the most fascinating times ever in terms of financial things.
So are you available for a public sector position if asked by one of our candidates?
Well, I was on the phone talking to Warren Buffett last night, and he said that his name came up during the debates. Right. I said, well, I'm glad it was your name, Warren. By the way, he said to me, he was super pleased that I was going to speak to Harvard Business School because it's the one school that rejected him. And at the start of the call, he said, hey, he's gotten over it. And then about 5 minutes into the call, he said he'd gotten over it. And then he only brought it up 2 more times. So he is clearly over it.
For any of you who have seen Warren in a setting where he's relaxed about this topic, this is something any HBS prof or anyone affiliated with HBS hears about over and over again. But anyway, thank you for that. I want to get to the core of our discussion today. You've recently stepped down as active chairman, executive chairman of Microsoft, and moved to another phase of your life. I'd love to have you share with our assembled group today kind of what led to your decision to make that transition. And for those of us who may not know the foundation as well as we'd like, we certainly have heard of it, we have superficial ideas. If you would please describe what the foundation really is, how it's organized, and obviously we'd be interested in things like governance and so forth.
Super. Well, there's no magic time, but I knew that as Microsoft was super successful and I was getting older, that it'd be right to get younger people into making the key technical decisions. And I also knew that I was lucky enough that the wealth that Microsoft had generated for me, that I wanted to make sure it went back to society in the best way possible. I didn't want to, just be sitting there on my deathbed, coming up with some random idea. And I had decided early on that it wasn't in the interests of my kids to have some huge portion go to them. They weren't young enough.
Your kids agree with that, by the way?
No, they weren't young. They were too young to argue about this.
Okay,
So
all right.
it'll be interesting to hear what they have to say. One of them did say, what should I think about that you're giving all the money to the foundation? And I'm working on the answer for that. Warren likes to say that you give kids enough so they don't. So they're motivated to work, but that they'd always be comfortable. Well, it's hard to know what that number is, but it'll be a small portion, because I do think that wealth is very distortionary. And so anyway, I had in mind, together with Melinda and my dad and some great people we were lucky enough to bring in, that getting involved in this giving back, that's what I wanted to spend full time on. And it's so fascinating because it's really at the nexus of capitalism. That's this incredible thing, has done such a great job, and even the people involved in it, I think, often forget how powerful it's been over these last 100 years. What the foundation is trying to do is take the areas where that mechanism falls short somewhat and trying to invigorate things by actually tapping into mechanisms of capitalism where possible. So you have areas where people can't afford to buy drugs, and therefore the incentive to invent those drugs is very, very small. So that's a certain type of market failure. A dramatic example of that is that if you look at the amount of money that's been spent on male baldness, it's 10 times the amount that's been spent on malaria. Now, male baldness is painful, I know. I've talked to Steve Ballmer about it.
That's good.
But, malaria kills over 1 million kids a year. At any time, 200 million people are suffering from it. It is an incredible damper on all activity, whether it's economic activity, learning activity. It targets pregnant women. It's responsible for 20% of all low birth weight children. It's this unbelievable disease that is actually the only disease that's actually so powerful that's actually shaped genetic evolution. We can look at different things like sickle cell and see that was the pressure of malaria deaths that caused that to happen. So in any case, there's almost no money that goes into it because the people who really need it have no voice in the marketplace. They don't have any money. And so that's clearly the kind of thing that a foundation should come in and do. It's not typical for government to do drug discovery. Yes, we have NIH for research, which is great, and FDA for drug approval, and CDC for epidemics, but there's no group whose responsibility is to invent a drug for the people who are the poorest. And so as I learned about that, I thought, wow, that's kind of an unmet need. And in fact, that's the kind of thing we've gone after. The foundation has 3 different groups. We have the global health, which is half of what we do, and that's these infectious diseases. There's about 20 of them, but the big 5, you probably all know that tuberculosis, malaria, and AIDS. And then 2 that are sort of childhood conditions, diarrheal diseases and respiratory diseases. Those 5 alone account for the majority of the difference between health outcomes of the poorest and the richest, just those 5. And if you add the other 20, the other 15 to get to the 20, then you get about 80% of that difference is explained. Now, these are infectious diseases, so if you can stop it spreading, you can have this dramatic effect, even potentially elimination for a lot of them. So that's half of what we do. There's a quarter which is are things for the poorest in the world other than health, things like financial services. And then the last quarter is focused on education here in the United States and helping the excellence of high schools and the excellence of community colleges and taking some new ideas about how those things can be done and trying those out, some experimentation. So in total, it's at this stage, because of the Warren Buffett gift that basically doubled our capacity, we give about $3.3 billion a year. And so it'd be 1.6 billion out of the global health and about 800 million each out of those two other groups. And that's enough that people should have a very high expectation that something dramatic can come out of that. I mean, getting rid of malaria. If we haven't done that in, I'll give us a little extra time, 15 years, we're stupid. We should be fired.
Interesting. Now, Bill, one of the things you will hear, however, is that what you might be doing, especially in intervening in some of the developing countries, is stepping in, doing work that government should be doing in those countries, and you might, in fact, in the long run, be inhibiting the ability of those governments and those people to develop their own capacity to deal with issues that they face by getting so operationally involved. First of all, make clear to us how operationally involved the foundation actually gets, but secondarily, then respond to that question.
Yeah, if you look at the difference between what's happened in countries around the world over the last 100 years, there's a huge dispersion. That is, if you go back 100 years ago, the health situation was not significantly different anywhere in the world. That is, close to 400 out of 1,000 children that were born would die before the age of 5. And that was true in the poorest country, and it was true in the richest country. It was true, wealth did not really change this outcome. And then starting in 1900, you started to have some of the richer countries, including the US and parts of Europe, diverge from that. And now we're in a situation in the very rich countries, you have about 10 children out of 1,000 die before the age of 5. And a lot of that is birth conditions that you probably can't get much below that. But so they went from close to 400 down to 10. Today, the very worst countries in the world are in the 200 to 250 range. So the worst country today is meaningfully better than the very best country was 100 years ago. So a combination of medicine and living conditions, nutrition, shelter from warm, from cold during the winter, various things like that, have improved things dramatically. And there's been the last 50 years, if you looked at 50 years ago, you would have said, okay, it's bimodal. There's two buckets. There's these very rich countries and the, quote, developing countries, quote, that are quite poor. And there's very little in the middle. What's happened in the last 50 years is a phenomenal thing, and I give capitalism and innovation, kind of the nexus of research, science, and business coming together, and decent governance. That mixture gets the credit for it. The majority of people living in developing countries are dramatically better off today than 50 years ago. China's the extreme example of that. They actually didn't get started until 1979, but their pace has been so unbelievable just in the last 20 years that they took about 400 million people who were in abject poverty and took them out of abject poverty. The amount of nutrition in the country more than doubled over that period of time. In 1960, there were about 70 million births. There were 20 million children who died. And recently, take last year, there were about 130 million births. 10 million children died. So you have almost double the number of births, and you have half as many children. 20 million goes to 10 million. And that's a phenomenal thing. Now, when you think of these numbers, it's 10 million still this incredibly tragic thing. It shouldn't be 10 million. It should be, 0. But how do we get from 20 million to 10 million? Innovation and governments doing things like vaccination. Vaccination gets the lion's share of credit for what happened. Of those 20 million who died, about 5 million died of measles. And now we've got measles down to something like 400,000 a year. Measles in Africa, for example, has gone down by 90%. It's an incredible story where they do these campaigns. There's this great tool. It only costs less than $1 per dose. So to really go to your question, yes, governance in many countries, Mexico, Brazil, China, large parts of India, governance, rational governance, along with innovation, has made these massive improvements. And so of the 6 billion people on the planet today, the number that are not in this virtuous cycle where you improve health and you improve education, you improve nutrition, you improve governance, all those things reinforce each other and you get on a positive trend. There's only about 2 billion of 6 billion that are caught in the trap. There's no such thing as a country with great governance, low birth rate, or decent economic conditions. There's a total correlation where you have high population growth is in the very poorest countries, and that's where you have terrible governance. And so you have to break that cycle because they're all reinforcing. Bad health, messes up the economy, it messes up education, and that creates a situation where it's very hard to get good governance. It's very hard to think long term and get the infrastructure and things you need. So now we only have that 2 billion to focus on, and we need to work with those governments. The foundation itself is granting money. We only have about 700 employees, so it's a lot, but say less than 90,000 that Microsoft has, or way less than is necessary for these activities. So it's giving grants, and often it's the governments that are given the money. Take an example, Vietnam, over 80 million people. They have the highest vaccination rate of any country in the world, better than the US, better than anyone else. And so we actually worked with them when we wanted to introduce a new vaccine to prove that it can be done even in a fairly modest income country. Now they're one of these countries that's on its way. They have a lot of things they need to do. There are countries, unfortunately a lot of which are in Africa, that are still caught in this trap. And so there you have to help the government do the right thing, you have to reach out to all different sectors of society, the nonprofits, the UN, the religious groups that might have capacity in that country, and do things. A good example is Zambia, where that was picked as the country to go and really do a big malaria intervention. To not just do bed nets, not just do residual spraying, not just do vector elimination, do all the things and see what sort of combinatoric effect could be achieved there. And so it's been a great coalition of groups. The government is the most important, but they understand that a lot of the capacity is not in their hands. They were picked because they have reasonable governance, which many poor countries don't. And they've done a great job. Malaria deaths in Zambia are down by 50% versus 3 years ago because of these interventions. And as you get, one very important thing about all of this is you improve health, the population growth goes down. That seems ironic. And in fact, the first thing the foundation got involved with was reproductive issues, making sure that if people around the world wanted to have small families, that they had the tools and the education to do that. And I thought, well, that's the thing to do. I can't do health because do I want more people or less people? If you're, isn't that working against yourself? Well, then, as I got to know the people in the global health community, I learned about this incredible connection that as you improve health, population growth goes down. In fact, if you take 1960, it's an interesting milestone. The Club of Rome published this very depressed document about how the world can feed itself, and it was all headed towards a Malthusian disaster. Well, the population projections at that time were the world would get to something like 20 billion, and that is a daunting number. Now that we understand better that as you get reasonable health, get reasonable economics, that birth rates go down. They go down very dramatically. The peak population will be somewhere between 8 and 9 billion. And if we can do good work on health, we'll be at the low end of that range, which is, a fantastic thing. The actual rate of increase of the world population as a percentage is lower today than it's been for the last 70 years. Now, in absolute, because we're on top of a base of 6.5 billion, it's still fairly significant, and ironically, it's concentrated in the poorest parts of the world. It's in northern India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, northern Nigeria. You just take actually 5 countries and you get the vast majority of that population growth. But these interventions step in to change that. And the government is going to have to take it over time, running the vaccination system, the primary care system. They have that role. And so it is a tough challenge for a foundation. What can you do? Take a country like Congo, that's very tough. We do vaccination there. In fact, countries that are very messed up, take Ethiopia, Somalia, vaccination rates are actually better there than in northern Nigeria. And you think of northern Nigeria as having a government, but the northern India and northern Nigeria are the places where vaccination rates are low. Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, like 35%, which is a stunningly low number. And so there are a few interventions that can work even when the government's very weak. Then as you get into things like roads, agriculture, savings, that just can't be done unless you have a fairly good government. And if you said to me, what's the one thing I wish I could put dollars against that we just don't know how? If I could write checks and get better governance, say in Congo, who designed that country? It's very strange. They should redraw the boundaries. Corporations, they merge, they spin divisions off. There's kind of this rationalization. Well, there's some things that are frozen in time in a very strange way. When you have failed states, you ought to be willing to make changes. Paul Collier actually wrote about that in his book, but I don't know that that'll happen. In any case, we don't know yet, and I'm super interested in ideas, on how external money can take really bad governance. And now you're talking about a fair number of countries, but total population fairly modest, depending on how you classify Nigeria, fairly modest, that are really in terrible governance situations. Pakistan, Bangladesh, northern India is weak governance, but not terrible governance. You can work with them. In fact, some great things are happening in every one of those cases.
So we have a number of our graduates and faculty and so forth that are involved in philanthropic activity. They really care deeply. They try to work through organizations as you've just described. What do you use to evaluate the effectiveness of outcomes? I mean, you've made it very clear you don't have enough people to actually do the stuff on the ground, which means you must have to have some mechanism that evaluates the performance of those that you work through. How is that set up? What's your measurement? If Bob Kaplan was here, he'd want to know what your scorecard.
Well, the scorecard is key, and I don't think there's a wonderful mixing of things that come out of the business sector that can be used in nonprofits. And there's a lot of, when you don't have the marketplace kind of slapping you in your face and telling you, hey, your product's no good, you can really get confused. There's a lot of wasted money that, it feels good, particularly once you get into a pattern of giving. It's hard to cut it off, and they're nice people, and they take you to lunch, and they tell you you're good and you're doing a great job. It's so easy to get incestuous and confused about these things. And we had this when we got into malaria. The malaria community was thinking along certain lines and just wasn't thinking ambitiously enough. Our scorecard is the number of malaria deaths. Our scorecard is do 2.5 million people get AIDS every year. Our scorecard is 10 million children died. That there are clear interventions, a few of which are still in the pipeline, some which already exist, but interventions that will be available in the next, say, 4 years, where that number should be cut in half. If you just raise vaccination rates, got some new vaccines out there, you could cut that in half. So the scorecard is pretty hardcore. In our global development group, a scorecard also is fairly specific. We gave a grant that was supposed to raise double the incomes of 250,000 dairy farmers in Africa. We gave a grant that was supposed to raise the incomes of 180,000 coffee growers in Africa. And that is very concrete. You can measure it. And there have been a ton of grants before that tried to do those same things, right. And you can go over and see the unused equipment. And so it is very daunting in some of these development things. Actually, the hardest area we have for our scorecard is not global health or global development. It's our work in U.S. education. Because there, the very metrics don't exist. As we think about where does capitalism fail or fall short, I think there's two key areas. One is that the poorest don't have enough money, and I talked about that in terms of drug discovery on their behalf or innovation on their behalf. That is a huge failing that we all have to consciously, whether it's individuals who give time, companies, we have to try and offset that. The second thing is that you have areas that, because measurement is hard, capitalism, at least so far, hasn't worked that well. The health sector is an example of that. The U.S. health sector, who wants to defend spending the increasing percent of GDP we spend to get the very poor and equitable outcomes that we get?
I assume you aren't asking Jeff Immelt that question.
Well, the innovation of companies like GE are a fantastic thing, but everybody involved in that sector wants the measurements to really look at the right thing, and then the value of that innovation. Which innovation? How can you go after asthma? How can you go after diabetes? What are the preventative measures? Then there'd be even stronger signals to Jeff's group about how they come up with the instruments that help in those preventative things. Today, it's the acute care that's paid for. Anyway, not getting into that. The healthcare and education are two areas where measurement is very difficult. If somebody said to you the best math teacher was a guy who died 100 years ago, you couldn't prove it wrong. You could say, oh, well, that's good. Well, why was he so good and people didn't learn from him? Well, there was no ability to kind of measure and record and benefit from that. And so when we say, we take some terrible measure like of all the people in ninth grade, a third of them will not graduate from high school. And if you take minorities in ninth grade, the majority of them will not graduate from high school. In fact, if you take black males, over 60% of them in ninth grade will not graduate from high school. So that's a measure. Yeah. But then you say, oh, well, this has got to be easy to fix. Let's have incentive pay systems that incent not doing dropout. Well, there you have a system that is not that willing to experiment with incentive pay type structures. You have a pay structure where if you're a good teacher, you get away from those tough students so fast and get up into this enclave within the public school systems that actually is working fairly well. Why does the country do well despite having such a terrible education system? The answer is that the kids go to private school, and these enclaves in public schools in total get somewhere close to a quarter of the population, maybe a little less, is actually getting a reasonable education. And the entire success of the country is leveraged on the fact that those kids go to our colleges, get mixed in with brilliant immigrants that we allow a tiny amount to come in, but we need to do more of that. And then that powers American business to be innovative and to be on the cutting edge of these science business boundaries. But that 75% that doesn't get that has a tougher and tougher time. And so the idea of how you measure this, the most basic things haven't been done. We've looked at how much a teacher improves test scores. Take math, which that's a pretty good metric, and there's no correlation to whether the teacher has a master's degree or not, whether they have a teacher certificate or not, whether they're very senior or not. There is no correlation, and yet if you're unlucky, the gap between the racial gap is about 2 years of classes. If you get the bottom quartile and somebody else gets the top quartile of teachers, the people who improve the scores the most, within 2 years you will have caught up just in terms of the teacher you have. Well, there's no extra reward for that person who's doing it that well. Not only that, there's no sort of video taken of them doing it so that you can transfer those skills. If you're one of the bottom quartile, you don't know you're the bottom quartile. Nobody tells you. The unions don't want you to know. Honestly, they passed a thing in New York where that you couldn't take test results into consideration in terms of granting tenure, because that, why would you take that into account? That's about the students. It's not about the seniority. Anyway, so you have it's a tough measurement problem, and so we need experimentation. We need to try things, and so actually saying what is our metric for all that money we're putting into education? It's a ton of money. And yes, we're improving community colleges, and we're sharing best practices, and people who come to the conferences like it. But that is our toughest metric. I think, we decided it was very, very important to take on the greatest inequity problem in the U.S., or what we thought was, which is education, and put at least a quarter of our money into that. But I actually think that's one of our most difficult things, because even as we come up with metrics for ourselves, our money is such a tiny piece that unless we get those metrics adopted, nothing will happen. Take the most basic idea of having national standards. Okay, you have national standards. Multiplication is the same in the East Coast and West Coast, division the same in the North and the South. Well, you have the Republicans don't like national, and the Democrats don't like standards.
You heard it here first.
And so the most basic thing that should go in can't go in. And No Child Left Behind, although it's kind of convoluted, it didn't generate much extra money, in this very complicated way where each state has its own test and you have to norm them back to try and compare them, it at least outed the problem. And now there's a lot of things saying, let's not test because it's creating this hot potato of, these schools are really terrible. Who's going to solve that? But if we stop testing, then we won't have to remember how awful the situation is. And so there's a real backlash against, why do you have all this data that's making us look bad?
Bill, again, a lot of our folks are involved in foundations, setting up nonprofit organizations, participating in them. And one of the things I think they'd be interested in knowing is how you think of the foundation as an economic entity in the following sense. First of all, I know you're very focused on building learning organizations. You love the process of feedback, improving the organizations. Have you moved to make the foundation a, quote, learning organization? And if so, how do you do that? And specifically, I'd be interested in knowing what you think you've learned since you first created the foundation that's instructive to you going forward, and what would you do differently at this point?
Well, I think the most magical time in any organization is when you're creating something new and you have a chance to bring in a mixture of talent, including really top talent, because you're taking on an exciting goal. And in fact, a manager, even if they're not creating something new, they have to kind of have a demarcation and make it as if something wholly new is being created, to zero base everything and to talk about new exciting things. For the foundation, we really were taking on something new. And take global health, there'd been people in various areas who believed in it, wanted to work on it, wished there was money in it, were off in the corner thinking about tuberculosis. When we were able to bring together a group of people from pharmaceutical companies, from field activities in Africa, from business background, and put them together and have a combination of those talents, it's really a magical thing, because the people understand the disease. They've been so starved for resources, you can get them to think in a new way and bring in new people. And they'll say things like, well, if this drug company would give us this compound, then we could do this. And we say, well, we can go to that drug company and we can get that compound, believe me. If I have to personally be involved, we will get that thing to go together. Or they'll say this UN group would work with that UN group. Well, those groups don't want to be shamed. They want to be praised. And so we're in an arena that a lot of things can be catalyzed, because there hasn't been a fresh look at it, there hasn't been new resources, and there hasn't been this combination of talent. In terms of learning, a lot of it's just like meeting with customers. You get out in the field, you spend time there. It is a field that has plenty of critics, and people love to criticize things. Take the most important thing that ever happened in human welfare in the last 50 years, which was the Green Revolution. That raised nutritional levels for half the people on the planet by a factor of 2, because output, ability to grow rice and wheat and corn, more than tripled out of those new seed varieties. If you look at all the articles that were written about it, over 90% of them are criticisms of the Green Revolution. And that's fine, but it's kind of weird. Nobody's paused, because I guess you don't get rewarded or something. When you write the article, it says, the Green Revolution is good. That article really wasn't written. Most of them were about, did smallholders fall behind? Was too much fertilizer used? How did the monoculture create certain types of risks? Which were perfectly legitimate things. But the tendency in the field that criticism is all that's newsworthy, it's a little dangerous. And so you want to pay attention to critics. But there's a lot of critics, say I'm stubborn, where you just say, no. We are going to come up with new vaccines. We think that's a good thing. We're not going to spend all the money just on delivering the vaccines. That is the unique role of the foundation, that we fund upstream, highly risky drug development, and then we partner with people on delivery things. And that role, which was not being fulfilled, we are going to stick to that, even though it feels like a technology guy always loves technology, which I plead guilty to. But it's a fairly magical thing. The thing where you survey people constantly, the employees, the grantees, the people out there, digital tools nowadays can give you a clear sense of these things. We have groups that advise each of those divisions, and we've been able to get unbelievable people on those groups, and they come in and they're good at critiquing things. And then you've got the metrics. At the end of the day, it's pretty simple. Have we made breakthroughs on these 20 diseases or not? Have we raised the incomes of the poor people we said we were going to? And we're putting all that information up online. That is, when I approve a dairy grant, $50 million, we put online what I was told that we were going to do, and then we show year by year whether or not we think that's happening. And you have evaluation that's built inside that group, and then you try not to have it too adversarial, but you have an independent evaluation group that loves to say, hey, are we being realistic about what's going on here?
Now, there's a lot of focus today on these huge developed economies, really, in places like India and China. As you think about your views on creative, constructive capitalism and how it can serve the greater good, and the challenge that you've alluded to a couple of times in places like that, what's your sense of how philanthropic activity will develop in those countries, and what intersection does it have with what you're trying to do at the foundation?
Well, let me take China first. They don't have a tradition of having rich people, and so as yet there's not a pattern in that society of whether the rich are expected to give a lot of money or not.
There'd be some people that would dispute that with you, that there have been a small percentage of the Chinese people who have had significant wealth at points in that past.
Well, not before 1980. I mean, they don't have a history like the U.S. Does. Now they do for the first time. And so I'm just saying there's not a tradition that's been developed. You know, the U.S. tradition of philanthropy really does go back to, you know, Rockefeller, Carnegie, a lot of people who did amazing things. You know, Rockefeller Foundation was unbelievably enlightened in the things they got behind. And, you know, the average foundation is not nearly as good as Rockefeller Foundation. We should all aspire to, you know, pick causes and be as good as they were. So I'm very optimistic that China can fall into the pattern more like the U.S. than other countries in terms of the rich being expected to not just give, but to give in a thoughtful way, to get involved, to get their family involved in doing things. China, because they've done such a good job on their agriculture sector and most of their health issues, the actual amount of grants of the foundation that go into China are fairly modest. We're doing some things on tuberculosis because they made some mistakes there. We're doing some things on AIDS because they have a tough problem with the fact that drug use is criminalized, and yet the outreach you want to do in terms of clean needle use and things involves getting out to those injecting drug users. That's the source of their epidemic, which is actually not gigantic. So we do give grants to China, but actually our biggest thing with China by far is working with China to help Africa, where, you know, Africa, the entire continent has about 10,000 people who are good in agriculture, who understand agriculture. China has 1 million. And, you know, when it comes to rice genetics and various things, including advanced biotech techniques for crops, China's doing great work. And so we have a lot of money that's with China to reach out to Africa. Now, India is different. They have more health challenges. We've done some unique AIDS things there. There's some great changes that took place over the last 3 years where they've increased their health budget by a lot, and it's being disproportionately spent on community health workers up in the north. And so they're going from a very low base, but a very high rate of improvement. And so partnering along with them to help the evaluation, make sure that's done right, that is super, super important. You know, of the kids who are not vaccinated in the world, 40% are, of all kids not vaccinated in the world, 12 million out of the 30 million, 40% are in northern India. So we really need to go after that and get the population issues there fixed. And I'm very optimistic about making that a model. There you do have some of the rich people already doing some giving. There's some partnerships we've done with some of the other people. That, you know, probably more could be done. I should probably tell them how much fun it is, and, you know, and make sure that the positive visibility is there for the people who do that the right way. But I think it hangs in the balance for both countries. Are they more like Europe has been, where government takes over a lot of these roles, and therefore the amount of innovation and trying new things is not as great? Or is it more like the United States, where philanthropy has always played a huge role?
Okay. In the last couple of minutes, you've got an assembled group that's the extended family of the Harvard Business School. What would you have us think about related to this new interest, a new chapter of your life? What would you like to communicate in just a couple of minutes as we wrap up here?
Yeah, I was thrilled that you asked me to come and speak, because I think this group here is in a very important position. American business, in terms of innovation power, is unrivaled. And, you know, it's a mix of how our universities do good work, how we fund risk-taking things, how the big companies are very dynamic and use modern tools the right way. It's a very phenomenal story. The idea is that we need to take a little bit more of that innovation power and understand the needs of the poorest, both in terms of the company being philanthropic and also looking at in terms of some of the future markets that emerge over the next decade or two as you want to get out in volume, you want to think about low-cost models and learn new things engaging in that. And so, my view is that every company should take, say, 5% of their deep innovators, their research group, and really get them to see the needs that are the poorest have in their area of work. For example, for a drug company, it's quite clear. For a cell phone company, there's amazing things that are going on helping the poorest with farming information. Safaricom in Kenya has done this money transfer system using mobile phones, and the foundation is funding getting that into many different countries. The banks, in terms of how you reach out to the poorest and help them. So almost any industry, food companies in terms of their buying and their expertise, you can say there's something that they can do, some expertise they should bring. Now, they can match employee gifts, they can give to important things, but I think the thing that's most exciting is tapping into that innovation power. And my belief is that particularly the younger people now, when they think about what company to go work for, or are they excited about the mission of a company, the fact that an element of that is to empower the poorest, to help them with whatever that company stands for, I think that's going to be very, very important. This interest in values and in doing more than just measuring things in terms of economics, I think it's very, very strong, and that so companies, there really is a win-win there in doing it. Now, sometimes we have to push on it. The U.S. Congress passed a law that if you come up with a drug for neglected diseases, you get what's called a priority review voucher, which is worth a fair bit of money, probably a few $100 million. That's a great thing because it starts to push things forward. And some of these inventive things may be expensive enough that companies do need to get funding from foundations or the government to help out with. They put their best people on, but some of the costs other people can pick up if they get too large. We have great relationship, for example, with GlaxoSmithKline, who's doing this malaria vaccine, and we fund a lot of it, but they have put their very best people on it, so it is a serious investment by them. So this idea that I sometimes call creative capitalism, of companies being more engaged in these things, I think there's a lot to be had there, but it's not just about dollars. It really is about the innovation power.
Okay. Well, look, first of all, let me say that on behalf of the President and Fellows of Harvard College, the Harvard Corporation, the Dean and Faculty of Harvard Business School, we really appreciate you protecting your commitment. Everybody in this room knows that you have a ton of touch points related to what's been happening over the last several weeks. And I'll just share with the group that Bill basically came across 3 time zones to be with us this morning, and will shortly after this session be going back across 3 time zones. And I can't tell you how much we appreciate you protecting this commitment and being with us. Secondly, let me just say how much so many of us appreciate you walking the talk. There are a lot of phrases out there, and certainly we at this school are really concerned about developing leaders who make a difference. You set a very high bar for those of us who aspire to operationalize that mission, and we appreciate you setting that bar that high and sharing with the greater world the benefits of capitalism. Finally, for the millions of people who've been touched by your business activities, and the billions of people that I know that will be touched by this next chapter in your life, William H. Gates, let me say thank you.
Great.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Where are we going now?
We should put you in the middle. Come over here. Come over here.
Okay.
From the very earliest moments when I was asked to plan for the Business Summit, I was haunted by the phrase I talked last night of our first dean, making a decent profit decently. And when I thought more about decently, as a person who spent his whole life in information technology, I admired nobody more than Bill Gates. From this crummy picture of 11 people I show, not the one that Jim did, I didn't have access to that one, to build this remarkable organization. But I was much more impressed by how he has chosen to use his wealth. It really is trying to make a difference, as Jim talks about, in billions of lives. That what Bill is talking about is the very essence of the Harvard Business School. It is what John Whitehead, when I talked about him last night, when he gave us our $15 million gift to really energize our faculty into this very broad area where our students are now deeply committed. And so I want to thank you, Bill, very much, first on behalf of the Harvard Business School for being here, but as Jim, much more for society. You really put the face of capitalism. I think all of us are proud.
Great.
Thank you very much.
All right.